So, I experienced child sexual abuse when I was 8 or 9 years old by the stepdad of my best friend, a serial rapist and paedophile who'd been grooming me since I was 5 years old. When I was 20, I reported him to the police, and after a 2-year court process, he ended up being sentenced to 13 years in prison. This man also sexually abused my best friend for about 7 years, and my best friend is no longer alive today. Whenever I mention I'm a prison abolitionist, the first thing people say to me is, what about the rapists and paedophiles? Shouldn't they be locked away? Isn't that the only way to ensure justice and healing for victims? And I think these are all totally valid concerns that I addressed in a similar video I made a few years ago, but I just found out my abuser has been released from prison 7 years early. At time of recording, he's now roaming the streets, which got me rethinking about this topic. Of all the videos I've ever made, this is the one that means the most to me. This is the one I feel most passionate about. And so as I've grown and learnt and evolved over the years, I wanted to build off of things I've said before and offer new perspectives. Prisons are often justified on the basis that they are healing for victims, which fails to take into account that the whole court system is itself a purveyor of violence. In my experience, the court process was not only re-traumatizing and re-victimizing, but in many ways worse than the abuse itself.
If one set out intentionally to design a system for provoking symptoms of traumatic stress, it might look very much like a court of law.
From the time I reported to when it went to court took 2 years. There were constant delays. I felt like I was in limbo period. My life was on hold, feeling totally unsafe because the abuser had threatened to take my life if I ever went to the police. There was a total lack of communication from the police, so I never really knew what was going on. I was treated more like a piece of evidence than a human being. I had to relay in excruciating detail every little thing this man had done to me over and over again, first to the police, then in writing, then in the courtroom with the abuser sitting right next to me, facing a constant onslaught of questioning, disbelief, skepticism, and victim blaming. It's hard enough to tell someone I love and trust, let alone a room full of strangers.
The very format of the court hearing offered by the criminal justice system is antithetical to the justice needs of victim survivors.
I gave all relevant information as evidence, including intimate text messages with my friends and my personal diaries. In one of my diary entries, I was writing to my dead friend, and I finished the entry talking about how my arsehole was bleeding, sounding totally unhinged, which of course the defense lawyer had an absolute field day with. My friends and my parents were required to give statements. They were questioned and called into court to give evidence on my behalf. What this meant in reality is I ended up being the emotional support for so many of the big feelings of my friends and family who were scared to go to court, and since it was my fault that they were going to court, it was considered my responsibility to take on this emotional labor. The strain that took on all of us means that some of those friendships have never recovered. One childhood friend I never talk to anymore, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive my parents for how they handled that situation. That being said, I kind of can't blame them in a way, because how the criminal justice system is set up makes it hard for people to provide emotional support for the person who's been harmed, because the system is more interested in incarcerating the perpetrator than healing for the victim. So when hearing about instances of abuse, people don't have a clue what to say without jumping to a carceral response. I remember at the time my dad kept talking about how we should just castrate all the paedophiles, that would solve the issue. Others kept talking about how we should just sue them or bring back the death penalty. I would have loved if just one person had asked me what I wanted, what justice would look like to me, or what support they could provide, to show me genuine care, love, and support, rather than simply regurgitating the hatred I should feel but didn't towards my abuser and wanting him dead.
We as practitioners of psychological science and practice can no longer passively support justice responses that the tools of our profession have revealed to be psychologically damaging and ineffective.
Going back to the experience of actually being in court, ironically, the whole court process actually reinforced a lot of the misogyny, sexism, and patriarchy that were responsible for the violence in the first place. The defense lawyer fixated heavily and graphically on the sexual acts in a way that felt objectifying and sexualizing. I was required to present a story of my suffering where I embodied a broken, innocent damsel in distress, irreparably damaged, who needs to be saved and kept pure. I really resonated with Professor of Criminology and Penology Barbara Hudson's argument that the narrative of suffering expected of victims in court relies upon
the phallocentric notion of women's sexual accessibility as that which is most precious to her, such that its violation is indeed a fate worse than death.
The rape narrative
yokes women's identity to her sexuality, and legal representations of rape thus reinforce the very stereotypes of male and female sexuality that perpetuate the sexual abuse of women.
The defense lawyer, whose job it was to discredit everything I was saying, kept calling me a liar, that I'm embellishing the truth, kept asking me so many victim-blaming questions like why I hadn't told anyone sooner or what I was wearing. It felt more like I was the one being put on trial. Whilst he was talking to me, he was dominating, aggressive, authoritarian, gaslighting me, manipulating me, patronizing me, which just replicates the same abuse dynamic I felt as a child, being manipulated by this predator.
As defense counsel, we are not burdened with a lot of the obligations that prosecutors have. We have free rein to do practically anything we want, as long as it is legal. We will impugn the integrity of the witness when we really don't have any justification for impugning their integrity. We can accuse victims of being promiscuous and highly immoral ladies, when in fact there is no justification for doing that. It's unfair, but our system builds unfairness. As a defense attorney, it is my job to exploit every opportunity for the defense of my client, the rapist. I'm not involved with the moral issues involved. It's the image of our client and the image of the woman that goes into the mind of the jury that's important. It's not what the actual facts are.
I didn't get any say over what facts were deemed relevant or how long he would be imprisoned for. Proportionate approaches to punishment suggest that crimes should be punished in direct proportion to the harm that is caused, which meant it was up to the jury, not me, to decide how much my trauma was worth. They measured the crimes based on a neat hierarchy of how violent the sexual acts were, but fixating on only the most violent forms of sexual violence normalizes and banalizes all other forms of victimization that don't fit this sensationalized violent image. I went into this in more detail in my Not That Bad video, but a lot of us are out here having experiences where we feel harmed and violated, but don't feel it really counts because it wouldn't be considered by the criminal justice system as violent enough to warrant mention. And anyone who's experienced any form of sexual violence knows it's so much more than what is criminalized. In my case, it's not the sexual abuse that keeps me up at night, it's the way he used to look at me or the stories he told me about little girls being strangled to death. But that wasn't considered relevant in the eyes of the law. It would have been so healing for me for my abuser to admit that what he did to me was wrong, to simply own up to it. But of course, the whole time he just pled innocent, because if he had admitted it, he would definitely end up being incarcerated. Even if he had pled guilty, it would probably have only been to get less years in prison. Even the then ex-wife of the abuser, who'd been a bystander to the abuse, accused me of lying because she was afraid of being arrested for being complicit. So the way the criminal justice system is set up doesn't incentivize people to be accountable to the harm that they caused. And people constantly tell me I should be grateful and happy. I'm one of the lucky ones that actually got a conviction. Most victims of sexual violence don't see any justice at all. No trial, no conviction, no prison sentence for the offender. But I don't feel lucky. I feel more unsafe now than I did before going to court, because now that he's out of prison, he might want to exact revenge. And the other women abused by the same man told the policewoman to tell me to thank me for coming forward because they were too afraid to. But this just got me thinking how sad it is, what a form of violence it is, that you only get justice if you have a conviction. So these women could have spent the rest of their days with no peace of mind, no closure at all. It also reminds me of a beautifully tragic memory I have with my best friend just before his death when we were about 15 or 16 years old. We were lying in bed together and apologizing to each other for the abuse we had experienced. He was apologizing to me because he felt he should have protected me, and I was apologizing to him because he told me when he was 5 what was happening to him, but I just didn't understand, and I felt I should have told someone. Instead, I said something really dismissive in response, and it honestly breaks my heart that my best friend went to his grave with this immense sense of self-blame and shame, not only for what happened to him, but also for what happened to me. After the court experience was over, this woman I'd known my whole life came to me and told me, "You know, you should have gone to the police so much earlier, then you would have saved so many other victims from being abused." To me, this is just another part of the violence of this system, that it puts all the onus on the person who's been harmed, even if that person is a literal child, to be the one to shoulder the burden of preventing rapists from raping. To me, the hardest part of dealing with sexual violence is not the violence itself, but being haunted by worrying about all the victims that came after me that I could have prevented. If I'd gone to the police whilst my friend was alive, would he have got justice? Would he be happier? Would he still be here? So asking what about the rapists and paedophiles, isn't that the only way to get justice and healing for victims? Ignores the fact that the criminal justice system inflicts immense psychological violence on victims, whether they choose to use it or not. So the criminal justice system also sets up a binary between victim and perpetrator. I have no doubt that one of the main reasons I was able to get my abuser locked up is because I was considered a good victim. By this I mean I'm white, cis, female, educated, thin, considered to be adequately rapeable, had no previous criminal record, did nothing to bring on the assaults, and am appropriately emotionally traumatized after the events. The policewoman in charge of my case actually referred to me as a good victim in one of our discussions, and she quickly backtracked saying, "Of course, there's nothing like a good victim," but I knew exactly what she was referring to. The more that you deviate from the socially constructed ideal citizen, the blacker, the fatter, the poorer you are, the less likely you are to be considered a victim in the eyes of the law. In fact, you're more likely to be harmed than helped by the criminal justice system, because the police is one of the most frequent purveyors of violence against these populations. So rather than keeping people safe, I think the criminal justice system actually makes certain groups of people extra vulnerable to violence, because perpetrators deliberately seek out vulnerable victims who are less likely to be considered credible victims, protected by the police, or believed in court. In my case, my abuser repeatedly targeted disabled children who he knew would likely die young, and therefore the evidence would be destroyed. I often wonder if my best friend had come forward whilst he was still alive, if he would have been believed as I had been, as a disabled male victim living below the poverty line. I'm not sure he would have been. I don't have any visible disabilities, but I'm pretty sure my abuser picked up on the fact that I'm neurodivergent as a reason for targeting me, and he was right that it made it harder for me to be believable in some ways, because reciting all these graphic things that this man did to me whilst smiling and laughing in the courtroom, I must have looked totally mentally unstable. The jury wouldn't have known that laughing and smiling is often the coping mechanism my little ADHD autistic brain goes towards when I don't know how to act in a social situation. So yeah, I think the criminal justice system might make some of the most privileged people safer, whilst also making the most marginalized even greater targets. The other issue I have with this neat dichotomy between victim and perpetrator is that it disguises the fact that the whole prison system is built off of the criminalization of survivors, the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. As prison abolitionist Daniel Serrid wrote,
"No one enters violence for the first time by committing it."
Hurt people. Most sex offenders have been sexually victimized themselves, but they're not allowed to claim victim status because their offender status supersedes their victimhood. And this hits particularly close to home for me, not only because my abuser, I believe, was sexually abused as a child, but also because I saw my best friend transform from the sweetest, kindest boy at 5 years old to this homophobic, sexist, racist just before his death at 16. A severely disabled boy, sexually abused for 7 years of his childhood, living below the poverty line. The only way he knew how to deal with his trauma was to push that hatred and venom onto others. I wonder if he were alive today, if he'd be yet another criminalized survivor. I don't consider myself better than my abuser or my best friend. I consider myself very lucky that my socialization as a woman, my access to therapy, my education meant that I was able to process my trauma in very different ways. Perhaps under other circumstances, I'd be just like them. And I think this really speaks to how this neat dichotomy between victim and perpetrator ignores the context that creates abusers. As long as the stories we tell about sexual violence are focused on innately pathologically evil people, this implies that individuals are the problem and contain all the evil, contributing to a cultural reluctance to explore the role socioeconomic violence may have in creating conditions for sexual violence to take place. I believe patriarchy teaches that violence, aggression, and power are linked to men's sexuality, that white supremacy makes certain bodies expendable, hypersexualized, and rapeable, and that structural oppression, like poverty and discrimination, is a breeding ground for cycles upon cycles of violence to take place. I could go on, but my point is that instead of asking how best we can make these evil people suffer, I think a better question is, under what circumstances does someone become a rapist and a paedophile? And even though it's easy and very tempting to focus on all the people who unambiguously seem evil and should definitely be locked up, like the Trumps, Epsteins, and Weinsteins of this world, despite brief sentences for outliers like Weinstein, his powerful counterparts, the people responsible for mass famines, genocide, and serial rape, aren't the ones who are going to be channeled into the criminal justice system. Instead, it's the poor and working class, particularly those from communities of colour, because the whole carceral system disproportionately arrests, charges, and convicts black men, trans people, the disabled, and poor for crimes that are committed by people of every race, class, and social status. So privileged victims like me, are absolutely entitled to our hatred and rage towards the pedophiles and rapists of this world. So many of us are in pain and care deeply about victims and wanting to make the world a better place. But we're not entitled to politicize our pain with no concern for what it might do to some of the most marginalized. This video is super long and will almost definitely be demonetized and therefore not shown much on YouTube, so I'd really appreciate anyone who takes the time to like, share, comment, and especially become a patron to help me to continue to make videos like this. I'm really trying to make YouTube more sustainable to me, so I thought it might be worth mentioning. For anyone who's ever considered it, I would so appreciate it right now. Back to the video. I remember being 20 years old and knowing I had a choice to make. Either I remain silent and allow this man to continue abusing and raping, or I speak up and sentence him to judicial abuse and judicial rape. There's a general cultural acceptance that brutal sexual violence in prisons is inevitable, and once again, it's the most marginalized who are disproportionately targeted. Sexual violence by police and prison guards routinely goes unreported and is arguably even a part of the job description, with things like cavity and strip searches becoming an endemic hidden crime. Trans people are routinely imprisoned in facilities that correspond to the sex assigned to them at birth, placing them at even greater risk of sexual violence. Prison Against Rape Inc., a prison-based anti-rape program, pointed out that prisons don't prevent rape. At best, they simply postpone heterosexual rape whilst perpetuating homosexual rape, which is seen as more socially acceptable because men are considered less rapeable. So prisons are supposed to be here to deter, incapacitate, and rehabilitate prisoners, but there's no good evidence it does any of that. Nor has increasing the amount of years people are incarcerated had any meaningful effects on crime rates. In fact, even short stints in jail makes people more likely to reoffend in future, and longer prison sentences are correlated with higher rates of reoffending than shorter ones. And this isn't surprising because this type of prison culture and environment is hardly a persuasive tool to prevent further gendered violence. I've kind of accepted it's inevitable that my abuser will reoffend now that he's out of prison. I actually think he's more likely to abuse now than if he hadn't have gone to prison, because he likely spent years being degraded, humiliated, isolated, dominated, and sexually assaulted, coupled with the fact that he has to do constant shame-inducing checkups with parole officers, is barred even from living in many shelters, will probably be homeless and jobless, and won't be able to integrate into society. Can we really blame him for reoffending when we've literally taken everything from him? As prison abolitionist Chloe Taylor brilliantly put it,
"It is arguable that anyone concerned with preventing sexual crimes should be engaged not so much in putting sex offenders in prisons as in keeping them out of prisons, since prisons is one of the most likely places for rape to occur, and for a culture of rape to be normalized."
And this isn't even getting into the cycles of violence that are produced through the impact the person being incarcerated has on their family and the people close to them. One of my family members was in prison for non-sex related offences, and I've seen firsthand the intergenerational trauma and violence that can be produced from someone you love being incarcerated. I made a vlog for patrons talking all about this experience and the impact this has had down the generations. But for now, all I want to say is if we're trying to end violence, we can't have a system that normalizes it as a form of punishment. Asking what about the rapists in the context of prisons ignores the fact that the police and prisons are the rapists. The critic Terry Eagleton writes in The Significance of Theory,
"Children make the best theorists, since they have not yet been educated into accepting our routine social practices as natural, and so insist on posing to these practices the most embarrassingly general and fundamental questions, regarding them with a wondering estrangement which we adults have long forgotten. Since they do not yet grasp our social practices as inevitable, they do not see why we might not do things differently."
And I honestly think there is so much truth to that, because as a child, I knew what this man was doing to me was wrong, but I was absolutely mortified by the prospect of him going to jail. And even at that age, I understood it wouldn't solve the problem. I could tell this man was in deep pain. I could tell there was something wrong with him. I could tell he needed help. My natural instinct as a child wasn't revenge or hatred or punishment, but love and empathy. So the little child theorist in me, long before I even knew what the term was, has always believed in prison abolition. Prison abolition is a theory based on the simple idea that prisons should not exist. It means an end to the entire caste rule system based on policing, prisons, detention centres, and surveillance. Unlike restorative justice, which has historically been co-opted, my favourite alternative to the criminal justice system is transformative justice, a community-based approach which is all about asking people who have been harmed, what would healing and justice look like for you? What is the root cause of this harm? And how can we make sure we can prevent it in the future? For me, transformative justice would look like sitting with my abuser in a circle of care with people all around us, flanking us, attending to our healing, becoming our surrogate family as they facilitate our conversation. And who knows, now that my abuser is out of prison, he could easily Google me and be watching this video right now. So if you're watching this, I would look you in the eyes and I would say to you, I see the wounded child in you. I'm sorry for whatever pain you went through that caused you to waste your precious finite life, externalizing your pain onto others. I can see how your violence emerged as a strategy of survival, and I see so much potential in you. You're not a lost cause, but in need of nurturance and resources. I want you to discover the beauty and divinity within yourself to such an extent that you can't help but heal the parts of yourself that are split off. And I want you to really feel what you did to me. I want you to know how much you hurt me and my best friend and so many others. I want you to know that you ruined my relationship with my dad, that I see you every time I see a bald man, that I have flashbacks because of you, and what you did still impacts my relationships as I replicate again and again the trauma with other men. I would like you to listen, to apologize, to acknowledge the harm that you did, and commit to self-transformation. I would like you to figure out what caused you to need to externalize your pain. Why do you need power over others? And what can you do to heal the pattern that happened here? In an ideal world, you would take this pain, process it, and use it to teach others how not to externalize your pain. People call me naive and idealistic for my compassion, but I think more idealistic is the idea that we can heal violence with more violence, treat trauma with more trauma. I think there's so much truth to Dr. Martin Luther King's statement that hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And it's not that I'm holier than thou for wanting this. I truly believe no greater punishment exists than for him to lead a healthy, contented life, because someone who is genuinely content has to deal with their demons, has to sit in the discomfort of realizing the gravity of pain they have caused. And some of you might be thinking at this stage, well, okay, so if we're all about putting victims first, what about victims that genuinely want retribution and vengeance? And I think these are totally valid concerns. I genuinely don't blame anyone for wanting a person that harmed them to suffer, end up in jail, or even dead. It's not my place to say you shouldn't want that, or it's bad to want that. I too sometimes have the urge to chop off my abuser's testicles. I'm definitely not presenting myself as better than anyone for being a prison abolitionist. In fact, I'm still really proud of myself for going to the police. I'd just found out he had a new baby girl who he was trying to get custody over, and going to the police was the only thing I knew how to do. But I think revenge is often the only justice we seek because it's the only justice that's been made available to us. I wonder if we were given a wider array of options, if we would choose something different. Research shows that the majority of victims of sexual violence don't actually want punishment. We want things like accountability, prevention, and having a voice. And even for those who do want punishment, it usually doesn't help them or heal them. All of that being said, prison abolition isn't just about the relationship between the harm doer and the harmed. It's also a vision of a restructured society in a world where we have access to everything we need. As prison abolitionist Angela Davis explained, abolition is about
both the negative process, overturning and destabilizing, but also the reconstructive process of creating something new. Not just one thing, but addressing all the enabling conditions.
I truly believe if we had social safety nets, the basic needs for survival and resources for victims, my best friend wouldn't have been so vulnerable to abuse because his mum was stuck in the relationship with his stepdad, even though she knew he was abusing her son because she was economically dependent. I would have been so much more likely to speak up as a child if I knew when harm occurs. We have mental health professionals and people trained in violence prevention to come to help instead of the police. I would have understood so much sooner what was happening to me was not okay if we had education to teach us about boundaries, consent, healthy relationships, and our bodies. And if my abuser had had access to re-education campaigns and therapy as soon as he was experiencing predatory urges, perhaps I wouldn't be sitting here today. And I'm not saying in this restructured world that everything would be hunky-dory and we'd never need something akin to prisons. In the case of people like my abuser who are serial rapists and pedophiles, they might need temporary removal from society, but instead of prisons, it would be rehabilitation centres where they'd receive mental health support until they were healed enough to return to society. Scandinavian countries have already had a lot of success with these type of models we can build off of. And people's usual response to this is, well, who's going to pay for that? Why give all this money to rapists and pedophiles? But we're already giving the money to rapists and pedophiles in the form of a costly prison system. Can you imagine if we were to repurpose the time, energy, and money we put into the criminal justice system into rehabilitation and prevention instead? And some people say, well, this is all so over the top. We don't need to abolish prisons. We could just have reforms instead. What about better trials for victims, a better sex offender registry, more laws to protect victims? But we've already seen how the carceral feminist movement towards harsher sentencing, policing, and investigation of sex offenders backfired. Lee Goodmark, a lawyer for women who've been through interpersonal violence, used to be on board with the carceral feminists.
The anti-violence movement believed that if we made these problems illegal, they would go away, but they didn't. The effect of arrest on recidivism is little to none.
That's not to say all reforms are inherently bad. There's a distinction to be made between reforms that help to strengthen the carceral state and those that are what Marxist André Gortz called
non-reformist reforms. Those measures that reduce the power of an oppressive system while illuminating the system's inability to solve the crises it creates.
It's also really interesting to me when people talk about how we can't do without prisons because of sex offenders, when it was only relatively recently that gender-based violence was considered a crime at all. Entire categories of sexual violence were invisible. No statute recognized marital rape. Sex on demand was a husband's right and a wife's duty. People were completely silent about child sexual abuse, and mostly these things were considered a family matter. There were few arrests, let alone charges or convictions for sexual violence. And the whole carceral system in and of itself is a relatively new phenomenon. Indigenous cultures across the globe have for thousands of years been practicing non-carceral responses to harm. That doesn't mean that we're just going to let all the rapists and pedophiles out willy-nilly. You're walking down the street and suddenly there's a bunch of rapists and pedophiles on the loose. We definitely have a long process of transition ahead of us. The activist and educator Mariame Kaba talks about how we've had 250 years of the carceral experiment, a well-funded prison and police system, but we've never had a period where transformative justice was funded. There's inevitably going to be growing pains, no alternative system is going to be perfect, but we're not starting from scratch. We have a long lineage of abolition work to draw from. And some people say, well, why should I do all this arduous work for the sake of inmates? And I totally get it. For the longest time, I thought so many other issues like climate change and child hunger were so much more important. Why give any of my time and energy towards prisons? Until I realized that the impact of prisons extends far beyond prisons themselves. It festers into every single facet of society. I mean, what does it do to us collectively to see some people as disposable and inherently evil? Is it possible to selectively increase carcerality without also increasing mass surveillance, infiltration campaigns, and the entire carceral state? What impact does it have on our cultures, families, and relationships to view justice in terms of shame and punishment? How might a system that responds to our mistakes, failures, and shadow sides via punishment breed a culture of fear, secrecy, and isolation? Because carcerality festers into every facet of our lives, I think it's really important that prison abolition is not just concerned with practical changes out there in the world, it also has to be a revolution in our consciousnesses. We need to dismantle the punitive instinct within ourselves, the patriarchy, the hierarchy, the supremacy, the domination. There's a line in Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed that really strikes a chord.
I think you Odonians missed the whole point. You threw out the priests and the judges and the divorce laws and all that, but you kept the real trouble behind them. You just stuck it inside into your consciences. But it's still there. You're just as much slaves as ever. You aren't really free.
So it's important we become compassionate to the less savoury parts of ourselves, get curious about how we've internalized the punitive carceral system, address our own patterns of harm and their root systems, and practice abolition in our everyday lives. So when people ask, what about the rapists and paedophiles, they're presupposing this system actually works. But as I've hopefully shown in this video, it does not. And when something can't be fixed, the question is, what can we build instead? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. This video will inevitably be demonetized, so I'd really appreciate if you could like, share, leave a comment, or become a patron to help support this channel. On Patreon, we do bi-weekly Discord calls. The next one is actually going to be about prison abolition and our internalized punitive instincts. And as I said, I upload monthly vlogs on Patreon where I discuss things much more casually that are on my mind that I wouldn't want to necessarily share on this channel. The last one was about my experience of a family member being in prison, and the other one was about my experiences of shame. But yes, thank you so much to my current patrons for helping to make this channel possible. Thank you so much to Jane and Opt Out for editing this video. And you can also check out my video on why I, as a survivor, am a prison abolitionist. I have one on why the phrase "not that bad" is rape culture, and I have one where I talk about my court experience in more detail. I'll link all those videos in the description box below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!